Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another trade recap. Today, we're going to go over the market. Today was a kind of hard day to navigate, so I'm going to try and break it down to the best of my ability for you guys so you guys can kind of understand how to go about days like these and kind of be on sides of the market or either stay out of the market. We'll kind of go over both scenarios and kind of why that is. So let's just get right into the analysis, break down what I saw coming into today. So first things first, we'll go ahead and go to the 4 hour. There's some confluences there that I do want to cover, and then we'll go ahead and come down to the 1 hour. So on our 4 hour time frame, what you can notice here on NQ is that we're super strong, kind of V-shaping here from the bottom with this SMT we made yesterday at this previous day low or this daily low. As you guys know, or I'm sorry, this daily low down here. My bad. As you guys know, we made that SMT yesterday, and then we ended up running up and running up very hard, right? So coming into today, we kept continuation off of that SMT, obviously. So basically, I did want to see if we were going to see some form of continuation into previous week's high. That was my main draw on liquidity. And then once that was taken, it got kind of hard, and I'll explain that a bit. But yeah, so on the 4 hour, we were in bullish structure so far, right? We made that SMT here at the bottom, held structure, held this 4 hour, right? Came up, right? Took a high, came back down, retraced. And then another thing I would like to point out is we did make this SMT here with ES inside of this gap, right? So that was like another confluence that kind of told me that price could potentially go higher. Now coming on to the hourly, this is where I can kind of explain more and break things down more clearly. So you guys will notice here, we have this SMT down here with ES, and you guys may have or may have not seen this 10 p.m. candle, form and actually, spawn. Basically, this was during Trump's speech last night. He had a speech at around 9 o'clock that went for, over an hour. And during that speech, this ended up happening. So I ended up labeling this as, Trump's speech. Basically, this is kind of like a data wick in a sense. Essentially, if we want to come down in price, it makes sense, we're coming down because of this, potential data wick. Ultimately, you can see we didn't come down for it, but that's just something that I kind of noticed. Now, the other thing I noticed as well, and I was actually awake for this during London, is we were starting to trend a little lower, right, grinding lower towards this low. But I was kind of wanting to see how this SMT was going to hold up with this. And then, I'll go down to the 5 minute and kind of align that. But continuing on with the hourly, we had, this small hourly gap here in the pre-market. We flipped this hourly gap here, I believe, on this candle. Oh, no, I'm sorry. On this candle, 6 a.m. Wanted to say that this one flipped it, but we didn't quite get it there. But 6 a.m., we ended up flipping this imbalance here, and then ended up making, like an order block / CISD because we have the SMT there. And then here at, 7 a.m., you can see we come down, end up retesting that CISD, seeking continuation into that previous week's high. So this is where things get a little bit, sketchy for today. Is previous week's high is ideally the objective, right? That was the ideal objective for the market, short term, right? And you can kind of see we got here and started to stall a bit before making, another push up. So now coming into the market, I was curious as to, whether or not we're going to use this previous week's high as a sweep to then come lower. Maybe we, from here at 8 a.m., I'm looking, we have this hourly gap. I'm thinking, okay, maybe we can sweep. Maybe we'll rebalance, come into the hourly. Maybe not, flip to go lower, but at the very least come down into internal levels, right? External to internal, right? And so ultimately you can see that didn't happen. So that's kind of where today was a little bit weird. You could easily have been, short bias coming into today and got caught off sides. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I can very well see the scenario as to, why you would believe we would short. Now, when NQ had taken this previous week's high, you'll notice if you guys were on the charts that ES had not immediately taken it in that time frame, nor did it take it at 8 a.m. So at that time we had an SMT, and once that SMT was invalidated, right, once we saw ES start to become strong, start to push over that, I'm like, okay, we can definitely seek a little bit higher, start looking for draws, potential draws higher. Now potential draws higher today were a bit tricky, and I'll kind of get into that, but we'll start scaling down on our time frames and get more into structure pre-market going into today. So going into the 15-minute today, what I noticed is that we did have this 15-minute gap down here that we did tap into. We also had an SMT in that gap with ES as well. So with that, I was kind of like, okay, maybe we don't necessarily need to come down to the hourly, but I was still, kind of wanting to see us, trend lower into that. And you can see here on like 8:30 on this candle, we kind of, start to grind lower. But I didn't want to execute anything pre-market today. I was telling my live group that, we didn't have any higher time frame, like 5 to 15 minute, structure to go off of to validate, a pre-market trade. So I, stayed out, waited for the market open. But 15-minute wise, that's what I saw. The other thing we also had coming into market open was this very, very, very small 15-minute gap. But gaps in the market are gaps in the market, regardless of how small they are. This gap ultimately still held. You could have easily got caught offsides thinking, oh, we're all the way down here through this gap, let me short. And, ultimately we end up holding that gap for higher. So sizes of gaps do not matter. You just need to be seeing the reaction. You never want to predict. You always want to react. So you want to see, okay, do we close below that gap? Now you can have a bearish bias, short term. Or, okay, do we react, to this gap bear or bullish? And do we, we can seek higher after that. You can have a bullish bias after that. Now, the other thing to align with that, is this slide 15-minute order block, right? I don't necessarily use order blocks a lot, but, in alignment with fair value gaps, they do work. So that's kind of what I saw on the 15. And then the other thing that I'm also seeing as well is we're failing to hold a sweep of previous week's high, right? So we didn't sweep previous week's high and get weak. We actually, ran previous week's high and continued to hold bullish structure higher at this point. So now coming into the market open, I'm like, okay, I do want to be bullish low key, right? We can see these internal SMTs with ES. I didn't really pay much of mind to it because this is just a range. So, naturally we're going to make, internal SMTs there. But what I did see was, coming into the market, we did have this 5-minute fair value gap that I had marked out. And I'm like, okay, if we, maybe flip this gap, I can definitely see us running. But I didn't want to pre-fire anything. This would have been a very, solid entry, right? If you would have caught something like this, upwards to this, 4-hour gap, if you wanted to target that, would be very solid, not bad at all. But, I play continuation. I typically like to take targets that are more near term, more, close to us in structure. And, from here, from this inverse upward, let me turn this magnet off. You're going for, 100 points right off the open. You could very well, get manipulated, right? We could very well come down, re-sweep for any reason, right? 30 points down, you get stopped, and then we make a run. So today I just did not like the pre-market structure enough to execute anything. And again, this inverse here, it's not truly a mechanically valid inverse. You would have to really have discretion when taking this here, because with this inverse, ideally, we would want to have seen this range, be swept out as like an AMD, right? Maybe put SMT, and then this inverse, in my opinion, would have been AA plus. But, we just got a very minor internal sweep SMT inverse. This would be a very discretional play. So I didn't really like that much either. So now we can scale down to the 1 minute. So now we're going into the open here. And the other thing I wanted to cover as well, back to the 5 minute that I wanted to show you guys during London, was that data wick. So this is that wick, right? This is clearly some kind of news, right? Some kind of manipulation of some sort, right? 10:30 p.m. during Asia, we typically are not seeing candles spawn like this. This candle was 82 points in its range, right? So that is not typical of Asia to spawn candles like that, in one go. So now we have that SMT with ES, right? ES ended up sweeping out these range lows. This is technically a valid rejection block, right? So on the 5 minute, this is technically a valid rejection block. And what do you notice? We have, true day open somewhat aligned with that midpoint of the rejection block. Now, during London, I did see this, and, I don't trade rejection blocks. I don't bottom tick. But, this entry would not have been bad, this rejection block to the inverse. But I was just tape reading. Right now I'm trying to only trade AM session. And then once I start building, some consistency back up again, then, I'll take some small jabs during the overnight. But this is very clean, right? We got this rejection block tab midpoint, right? CE tap on the rejection block, clean inverse reaction. If you didn't want to limit order down here, you get a clean confirmation here, right? You can have a tighter stop and then, end up letting this run through London and through New York. And, this obviously just kind of just ran insane. Obviously your full target would have been previous week's high, but, not a bad setup either way. Now, getting back into today's actual structure, looking at the 1 minute here, right off the open, this reaction was, very telltale, right? It's, this reaction right here, this opening candle 9:30 gives you the, obvious standout point that we're going to go for this 4-hour gap right here. So before market open, we had this unfilled 4-hour bearish gap here, right? And, once we're past this previous week's high, now I'm trying to frame, potential draws higher that we could go for. And, that is a potential draw higher that we can go for. So, rebalancing on the higher time frame, typically we're going to see price, right? We're going to see price come out, sweep out external range liquidity. So in this case, ES is what swept out the external range liquidity, right? And then we're going to, go back for, internal range liquidity, right? So in this case, we swept out external, right? We're flipping back higher and we're going for internal liquidity, right? These are internal highs in the higher time frame. This 4 hours an internal point of liquidity, right? And then once you start getting, up here, this is like an external point in liquidity to this range, and then, so on and so forth. So very valid to target that 4 hour gap after previous week's high was clearly getting displaced past. At this point, previous week's high is back here. Here's your 930 open, right? It's very clear we're not sweeping to go lower, right? So I did want to frame an entry off of this candle here, but, I noticed that this candle displaced way too hard, for RR purposes, right? I wouldn't have been able to catch a, good art risk to reward by targeting the 4 hour fill. Now, obviously, in hindsight, you could say, yeah, you could have targeted, deeper into it for 1R or targeted CE of it, which is very true. But in this case, price at this point was super extended, and it's very possible that we could have came into this 4 hour stalled or, got a retrace, whatever the case. So for me, this just wasn't a, very probable, good entry. If I got a better risk to reward and, got at least a 1R up to this 4 hour fill, then it very well would have been valid, right? We had these internal SMTs, like I said, clear as displacement. And then, at this point, we can assume that we're going for the 4 hour fill. But for me, I just couldn't get anything inside of that. So now I'm kind of waiting, right? Now at this point, we don't have any kind of valid setups into the 4 hour. Some people may have looked at this and decided to take something like this, which is completely fine. But yeah, you would get a 1.3R. But the thing is then you have, this entire 1 minute gap here to worry about where, we can re-sweep this low that barely ticked into it. And then, you're stopped out. So again, not a very probable trade in my opinion to take, although the draw is very clear. This gap needs to be, rebalanced more in some cases. Obviously in today's case, we, wicked into it and reacted out of it. But this is a, almost 50-point gap. So typically when you see gaps this big, we'll get a slight reaction, come back, re-sweep, and then get the, actual move. So again, faded that. And that's just basically out of discretion. So I pretty much watched all of this move here. And I'm like, wow, like, that's actually insane. Now, once we got up to this point and we're inside of the 4 hour, I'm like, okay, we may start to, reverse. Again, we were only moving up at this point, right? No proper retraces. So at this point here, we could expect that price is going to give off some form of retrace at some given point. Now, at this point, I really wasn't looking for a trade anymore. I'm not going to lie. I was kind of like, okay, I'm not really open to taking anything. I'm going to go ahead and sit out because, we've taken out the draws that I wanted to see. And there's really no point of putting risk on, at this point, super extended. Anything short, is just trying to call a top. And then, longing, you're longing in a premium. So what I did see was we had opened up a 5 minute here. This is what this blue box here is. We opened up a 5 minute, and on the 4 hour, we had this 4 hour wick. Now, I know some people were probably assuming previous day high, or not previous day high, this is a daily candle high. I just didn't change the mark. But some people probably thought we'd go for 419 draw. Now, understand the size of the wick on this candle, right? This is a very, very prominent wick. And let me find a candle that has, like a high that has not so much of a prominent wick, right? A high like this, right? Our previous week high, right? Yes, it's a prominent wick, but you can notice that a candle already came in, filled, right? We saw some reaction out, et cetera, et cetera. This wick is no longer, a true bearish confluence in the market. We don't expect for us to react off of it again. It's a valid draw. This wick is also your previous week's high, which we were in, clear displacement towards, right? But in a case like this, where we have a wick that taps into, an area with an SMT, right? We leave a very prominent wick behind, leave a very big move down. It's, important to go ahead and mark out this wick fill, right? So this wick fill to the high is 70 points. So a lot of times what I'll do instead of targeting the actual high itself, I'll target us filling in the wick. And you'll notice today we filled in that wick and then started to stall out in price. So this is not necessarily a rejection block, but it's just an area where price can potentially stall. These wicks, they hold orders, right? Wicks and bodies tell the story of price. You want to understand how wicks and candles work, or wicks and bodies work together. So, smaller wicks, like this right here, this is something that's simple to get swept, right? smaller wicks like this, eventually, we'll probably see this get swept, right? But, bigger, huge wicks like this, right? We may see us wick fill to go higher. And then, in this case, we also have a draw on liquidity that sits right almost at the midpoint of that wick, right? So, in this case, we could have conviction like, okay, hey, this is actually a valid rejection block in the market. But yeah, just a little bit about that. But let's get back into basically what I took. So, sorry for the ranting, but today was a bit difficult, and I do want you guys to be able to navigate these days successfully, by either preserving capital or being able to, you know, catch a solid trade, and adapt to the conditions overall. So again, we had this 5 minute tap. We saw a solid wick off reaction, right? So I put very light size on this, and as you guys probably have seen me post in either servers, depending on which server you're from. I'm pretty sure I posted them pretty much all of them, but took very light size on this here, and I took this trade into this 4 hour wick fill, right? So we can see price came here, edge this 4 hour wick fill, right? And then we open up this 5 minute, manipulate down into the 5 minute, right? We take out this internal low along with that right here, okay? And then we see a very strong wick up, right? Look at this wick, right? Price drew down all the way. We opened up here, price drew down 20 points, then wicked back up and closed bullish. So that's a, bullish reaction to that 5 minute at this point. So I went ahead and entered the close of that candle, put my stop just at the internal low, right? Very tight stop, pretty much 20-point stop essentially. And then a 25-point TP, 1.2 R. And you can see the next candle fully just displaced all the way up. Didn't really even need to go break even on this trade. I pretty much went break even the second we just started displacing here heavily. Just went break even, assuming, okay, boom, we're going to go take out this internal high, tap into that 4 hour wick, done. And ultimately, you can see, right? I mean, I couldn't have held any kind of runner or held this trade at all, right? We tapped that 4 hour wick and came lower. So obviously now, we're back up higher, potentially looking to take a high day maybe. But, we're just kind of grinding, right? We made a huge expansion move, and now we're kind of grinding. So, you got to have some discretion. And again, discretion is built just through time on the charts, understanding when trades are not, in your best interest to take. You want to be using logic at all times. So it's like, okay, this trade, yes, this is a clear displacement candle. Yes, the draw is clear, but you need to put your stop in a logical place, which is at least at the bottom of the displacement candle. And, you just don't get good RR to make it worth your while, right? If you do end up getting stopped, it's like, damn, you got stopped on a negative RR trade, that kind of blows, right? And then, some of these trades here, like, playing continuation off of any of these areas, right? It's kind of hard to do. We kind of just chopped in price, grinded into that 4 hour. Again, hard to do. So yeah, you just have to have better discretion. And, in this video, I kind of wanted to try and break things down as best as I could, so you guys can kind of understand a little bit of why price was the way it was today. Now, it would have been ideal for price to give a nice retrace down. But ultimately this gap SMT here ended up holding us overnight, pushing us higher. But it was just really weird conditions because previous week high was taken in the pre-market. So very hard to anticipate that we're just going to kind of run up, this hard. And, the other thing as well is overnight didn't necessarily range too hard. This is somewhat of a range, but, we did get some pretty, volume moves up and down throughout Asia and London. So was kind of expecting somewhat of a dry day, also having Nvidia earnings at the end of the day as well. And then taking out the clear draw. But, ultimately came out somewhat green on the day. I did about 300 per account on the day, and I'll show you guys that here, as you can see. So did about 300 per account. And I mean, yeah, basically, I don't know. It's just a very weird day to navigate. Ultimately, realistically, I should have sat out at this point, but to me, I mean, this rejection here was just very clear to take. And I mean, we had a clear draw being this 4 hour wick fill. At this point, we're super extended through the 4 hour gap. So it seems like price is seeking something a bit higher. That prominent wick is there. We end up using that prominent wick as a target and, deliver a nice scalp trade. But that is a good rant, about a 20-minute video here again. I think that just about covers it. I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover here. Hopefully you guys are getting some value out of these videos. As you're noticing, they're becoming a bit lengthier, which, I hope you guys do appreciate. I'm trying to get as much sauce in there as I can without, rambling on too much. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Again, if you guys do enjoy these videos, be sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll be sure to drop more content for you guys in the future. Looking to keep dropping daily. I do want to get some other types of video ideas going, other than recaps. So if you guys do have ideas, go ahead and drop them down below, and I'll be sure to take a look into them. But other than that, guys, take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.